We often believe that love fails because we chose the wrong person, didn't try hard enough, or somehow lacked the right language to be understood. But what if love doesn't break in adulthood? What if it was already wounded long before we ever learned the word for it? What if the pain we experience in intimacy is not a personal failure, but a memory held not just in the mind, but in the nervous system, in the body, in the ways we learned to survive when love first came with conditions? Today we are not here to assign blame, nor to diagnose ourselves or others, but to gently inquire into the roots of why love can feel unreachable, unsafe, or endlessly exhausting. Because when we understand the wound, we stop mistaking it for who we are. For a child, love is not a feeling, it is a necessity. And because it is a necessity, the child will do whatever is required to preserve it. If love is freely given, the child relaxes into themselves. But if love is conditional, inconsistent, or withdrawn in moments of emotional need, the child does not rebel against the caregiver. The child rebels against their own inner truth. This is not a conscious choice. It is an act of survival. When being authentic threatens connection, authenticity becomes too costly, and the child learns that to be loved, they must disappear in certain ways. This is the original betrayal. Not the betrayal by the parent, who may themselves be wounded and doing their best, but the betrayal of the self. The child learns often very early that certain emotions are unwelcome: anger, sadness, fear, need. These emotions do not vanish. They are simply pushed out of awareness, stored in the body, held in muscle tension, shallow breathing, and chronic vigilance. Over time, the child becomes skilled at sensing what others expect, need, or tolerate, and reshapes themselves accordingly. This is how we lose the felt sense of who we are. When such a child becomes an adult, love is no longer a meeting of two authentic beings. It becomes a performance, a negotiation, a balancing act. Intimacy feels dangerous because intimacy threatens exposure. To be truly close would mean risking the return of an old pain: abandonment, rejection, emotional withdrawal. So the adult may seek love desperately, yet feel suffocated when it arrives. Or they may remain distant, self-sufficient, and guarded, while secretly longing to be known. Neither posture is a failure of love. Both are echoes of an early adaptation that once kept the child safe. We often ask, why do I keep choosing unavailable partners? Or, why do I shut down when someone needs me? But these questions assume something is wrong with us. A more compassionate question is, what did I have to give up to stay connected? Because the nervous system does not distinguish between past and present when old patterns are activated. When closeness arises, the body remembers a time when closeness required compliance, silence, or emotional labor. Love then feels like work, obligation, or danger, rather than nourishment. This is why insight alone is rarely enough. We can understand our childhood intellectually and still find ourselves reacting in the same ways. The wound is not held in the story. It is held in the physiology, in the tightening of the chest when someone asks for reassurance, in the numbness that arrives when conflict appears, in the reflex to please, fix, withdraw, or control. These responses are not choices, they are conditioned responses shaped in a time when the cost of authenticity was too high. To say that love becomes impossible is not to say it is permanently lost. It means that love, as presence and mutuality, cannot coexist with self-abandonment. As long as connection requires us to override our own boundaries, emotions, or truth, love will feel fragile or unsafe. We may call it love, but it will be driven by fear. Fear of being too much, not enough, or ultimately alone. Healing begins not with learning how to love better, but with learning how to stay present with ourselves. When we start to notice the moments we leave our bodies, silence our needs, or tense against closeness, we are no longer reenacting the wound unconsciously. We are bringing awareness to it. And awareness, approached with compassion rather than judgment, creates choice where once there was only reflex. The child does not enter the world asking how to succeed, how to perform, or how to be acceptable. The child arrives with a simple biological imperative to feel and to connect. Feeling and connection are not separate processes in early life, they are the same. A child feels in relationship, and relationship teaches the child whether feeling is safe. When the environment welcomes emotion, the child learns to inhabit their inner world. When the environment is stressed, distracted, overwhelmed, or emotionally unavailable, the child learns something very different, not through words, but through experience. Before a child learns language, before they develop a narrative identity, they are already adapting. The nervous system scans constantly for cues. Is it safe to cry? Is it safe to express anger? Is it safe to need comfort? If the answer is repeatedly no, the child does not stop needing. they stop expressing. This is not repression as an adult concept, it is adaptation at a biological level. The child's system prioritizes attachment over authenticity because attachment is survival. In such conditions, adaptation becomes intelligence. The child becomes attuned to the emotional states of caregivers, often more attuned than the caregivers are to themselves. They learn to read moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust accordingly. This is often praised later in life as empathy, maturity, or sensitivity. But beneath it lies the loss of spontaneous self-expression. The child learns to think before they feel, to monitor before they express, to manage the environment instead of inhabiting their own experience. Feeling becomes secondary to functioning. The body tightens to stay alert, the breath becomes shallow, the mind becomes busy. Over time, the child may no longer recognize what they feel at all. They know what others feel. They know what is expected. They know how to be useful, impressive, or invisible. But their own inner signals fade into the background. This is not because they are weak or disconnected by nature, but because feeling once led to disconnection. As adults, this adaptation often shows up as competence without fulfillment. People may appear highly functional, successful, even admired, yet feel strangely empty or restless in relationships. Love feels confusing because it asks for presence, and presence requires feeling. When someone asks, "What do you need?" the question may provoke anxiety rather than clarity. When intimacy slows things down, the body becomes uneasy. There is an impulse to fix, to distract, to perform closeness rather than rest inside it. We often misunderstand this as emotional unavailability or fear of intimacy. But what is actually happening is that the adult nervous system is doing exactly what it learned to do early on: prioritize adaptation over experience. The child who once had to be easy, strong, or low maintenance becomes the adult who does not know how to receive. Love feels effortful because it requires a capacity that was never fully developed, the capacity to stay with one's own emotional truth in the presence of another. This is why telling someone to open up rarely works. Openness is not a decision, it is a state of safety. The body must believe that feeling will not lead to rejection, overwhelm, or loss of connection. Until that belief changes at a somatic level, the mind can understand love and still be unable to tolerate it. The adult may long for depth, yet unconsciously choose relationships that keep feeling at a manageable distance. To heal this wound is not to force emotion, but to rebuild the capacity to feel gradually, safely, and without self-judgment. It is to recognize that numbness, detachment, or overthinking are not failures, but protections. When we approach these patterns with curiosity rather than shame, the nervous system begins to soften. Feeling returns not as a flood, but as small sensations: tightness, warmth, sadness, relief. And in learning to stay with these sensations, the adult slowly reclaims what the child had to set aside: the right to feel without losing connection. Not all wounds come from what happened. Some of the deepest wounds come from what did not happen. A child can survive harsh words, strict rules, even moments of anger, if there is also repair, warmth, and emotional presence. But when emotional presence is missing, when there is no one truly attuned to the child's inner world, the child faces a different kind of pain. This pain has no clear memory, no dramatic story, and therefore often goes unnoticed. Yet it shapes the way love is experienced for a lifetime. Emotional absence occurs when a caregiver is physically present but emotionally unavailable. They may be preoccupied with stress, trauma, depression, addiction, or their own unmet needs. The child may be fed, clothed, educated, and protected, yet feel unseen. There is no one consistently curious about what the child feels, fears, or longs for. The child learns that their inner experience does not matter enough to draw attention. Over time, they stop offering it. This kind of absence is particularly confusing because there is no obvious harm to point to. The child may even feel guilty for their pain. Nothing bad happened, they tell themselves. Others had it worse. But the nervous system does not measure trauma by events, it measures it by unmet needs. A child needs to be mirrored, soothed, and emotionally held. When these needs are unmet, the body registers distress, even if the mind later minimizes it. Without emotional mirroring, the child does not develop a clear sense of self. They do not learn, through another's attuned response, that their feelings make sense. Instead, emotions arise in isolation. Sadness feels overwhelming, fear feels uncontainable, joy feels fleeting. Because no one helps regulate these states, the child learns to regulate alone or not at all. They may become emotionally self-sufficient early, or they may shut down to avoid the intensity of unshared feeling. As adults, this wound often appears as a quiet ache rather than overt pain. People may struggle to articulate what is missing, only knowing that relationships feel hollow or disappointing. Love may feel unsatisfying, not because the partner is wrong, but because closeness fails to touch something deep. There is a sense of being emotionally hungry, even while being emotionally independent. The adult may crave intimacy yet feel strangely bored or disconnected when it is offered. This is because emotional absence teaches the child that connection does not meet emotional needs. The adult then carries an implicit belief that relationships are unreliable sources of comfort. As a result, they may rely heavily on self-regulation, thinking, working, distracting, or numbing. Vulnerability feels pointless or risky. When partners attempt emotional closeness, it may feel intrusive rather than comforting, because closeness was never associated with safety. Another common adaptation is emotional overfunctioning. Some adults become the emotional caregivers in relationships, attuned to others' feelings while remaining disconnected from their own. This recreates the familiar role of managing connection without receiving it. Giving feels safer than receiving, because receiving requires trust that was never established early on. Love then becomes something one provides, not something one experiences. The tragedy of emotional absence is that it often goes unnamed. People blame themselves for being too sensitive, too needy, or emotionally distant, without realizing that these patterns once protected them from a deeper pain. The pain of reaching out and finding no one there. Love becomes difficult not because the heart is closed, but because it learned early on not to expect resonance. Healing this wound begins with acknowledging its reality, not dramatizing it, not blaming, but honoring the impact of what was missing. When emotional absence is recognized, the adult can begin to offer themselves what they did not receive: attunement, patience, and validation. Slowly, through safe relationships and inner awareness, the nervous system learns that emotional presence is possible, that feelings can be shared and met, that connection does not always end in emptiness. And as this new experience takes root, love no longer feels like reaching into a void, but like meeting another human from a place that has finally inhabited. The body is not a passive container for experience. It is an active participant in how we remember, interpret, and respond to the world. Long before the mind can form a coherent story, the body is already recording information. It records whether touch is safe, whether voices signal comfort or threat, whether closeness brings warmth or tension. These records are not stored as memories we can recall at will. They are stored as patterns of sensation, posture, breath, and reflex. This is why people often say, "I know this person cares about me, but my body doesn't feel it." When a child grows up in an environment where love is unpredictable, conditional, or emotionally absent, the body adapts. Muscles tighten to brace for disappointment. The nervous system remains alert, scanning for shifts in tone or mood. The heart rate changes not in response to present danger, but in anticipation of past pain repeating itself. Even when the adult mind understands that the present situation is different, the body reacts as though the past is happening again. Forgiveness does not erase these imprints. Understanding does not dissolve them. A person may forgive their parents, empathize with their struggles, and still find themselves anxious, numb, or reactive in intimate moments. This is often confusing and can lead to self-blame. If I've moved on, why do I still feel this way? The answer lies in the fact that the body does not operate on insight. It operates on association. It responds to what feels familiar, not to what is logical. In adult relationships, this shows up in subtle but powerful ways. A delayed text can trigger a surge of panic. A partner's silence can feel like abandonment. A raised voice can cause the body to shut down entirely. These reactions may seem disproportionate to the present moment, but they are entirely proportionate to earlier experiences that overwhelm the child's capacity to cope. The body is not overreacting, it is remembering. Because these memories are implicit rather than explicit, people often struggle to explain their reactions. They may say, "I don't know why this affects me so much," or "I just shut down." The lack of narrative makes the experience feel mysterious and out of control. This can create shame, especially when others interpret these responses as immaturity or emotional instability. But the body is doing exactly what it was trained to do: protect against pain by mobilizing, freezing, or withdrawing. This is also why love can feel exhausting. Intimacy requires presence, and presence requires the nervous system to be regulated. When the body is constantly bracing for threat, closeness demands enormous energy. The person may crave connection, yet feel depleted by it. They may alternate between longing and withdrawal, not because they are ambivalent about love, but because their body associates love with danger, effort, or loss. Attempts to override these responses through willpower often fail. Telling oneself to relax, trust, or let go can even intensify the problem, as the body experiences these commands as pressure rather than safety. Healing does not occur through force. It occurs through creating conditions in which the body no longer needs to defend itself. This means slowing down, noticing sensations, and allowing responses without judgment. When someone begins to listen to their body rather than fight it, something shifts. The tightness in the chest becomes information, not an obstacle. The urge to pull away becomes a signal, not a flaw. In this listening, the person starts to separate the past from the present. The body learns, gradually and through repeated experiences, that not all closeness leads to harm, that some relationships can hold discomfort without collapsing, that safety can be felt, not just understood. As the body begins to trust, even slightly new possibilities emerge. The breath deepens, the shoulders soften. The impulse to flee or numb loses some of its urgency. Love no longer triggers only old alarms, it begins to create new associations. But this process cannot be rushed, because the body learned its lessons slowly, over years of repetition. It will only unlearn them through patience, consistency, and compassion, offered not as an idea, but as an embodied experience. When we speak about attachment patterns, we often use labels that sound diagnostic or limiting: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, as though they describe fixed personality traits. But attachment patterns are not who we are. They are what we learn to do in order to stay connected. Every pattern begins as an intelligent response to a specific relational environment. The child does not choose how to attach. The child adapts to what attachment requires. If a caregiver is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, the child learns to intensify connection. They become vigilant, emotionally expressive, and highly attuned to signs of separation. This is not neediness, it is strategy. If a caregiver is emotionally unavailable or overwhelmed by the child's needs, the child learns to minimize expression. They become self-reliant, quiet, and emotionally contained. This is not independence, it is protection. In environments that are chaotic or frightening, the child may experience attachment as both necessary and dangerous, leading to confusion and internal conflict around closeness. These strategies work in childhood. They preserve proximity. They reduce threat. They help the child survive emotionally. The problem arises when these same strategies are carried into adulthood, where the original conditions no longer apply. What once ensured connection now interferes with it. The anxious strategy may overwhelm partners. The avoidance strategy may create distance. The disorganized strategy may generate cycles of pursuit and withdrawal. But at their core, these patterns are not about dysfunction, they are about adaptation. Because these strategies operate largely outside conscious awareness, people often experience them as impulses rather than choices. The anxious person may feel compelled to seek reassurance, even when it feels humiliating. The avoidant person may withdraw automatically when intimacy deepens, even when they want closeness. These behaviors can be deeply frustrating, especially when they conflict with conscious values or desires. Why do I keep doing this? Becomes a painful and recurring question. Shame often follows. People judge themselves for being too much, too distant, too sensitive, or too cold. But shame obscures understanding. When we label survival strategies as flaws, we miss the wisdom embedded in them. Each pattern carries information about what the child needed, but did not receive. The anxious pattern speaks of a need for consistency and reassurance. The avoidant pattern speaks of a need for space to feel without pressure. The disorganized pattern speaks of a need for safety in the presence of closeness. In adult relationships, these patterns often collide. One person's pursuit activates another's withdrawal. One person's need for space triggers another's fear of abandonment. What looks like incompatibility is often a meeting of two nervous systems shaped by different histories. Without awareness, partners may personalize each other's responses, interpreting them as rejection, control, or lack of love, rather than as protective reflexes. Understanding attachment as survival rather than pathology changes the tone of healing. Instead of trying to eliminate patterns, we begin to work with them. We notice the sensations that precede the behavior. We learn to pause. We develop language for needs that were once expressed only through reaction. This does not mean forcing ourselves to behave differently. It means creating enough safety to respond differently. As safety increases, attachment patterns soften. The anxious person learns that connection does not require constant vigilance. The avoidant person learns that closeness does not erase autonomy. The disorganized person learns that intimacy can be stable rather than chaotic. These shifts do not happen through insight alone, but through repeated experiences of being met differently than before. When we stop seeing attachment patterns as defects, love becomes less of a battleground. Compassion replaces blame, both for ourselves and for others. We begin to recognize that behind every reaction is a younger self who learned, very early on, how to survive love. And in honoring that origin, rather than fighting it, we create the conditions in which love can finally become what it was meant to be, a place of safety rather than strategy. Many people believe they are afraid of intimacy, when in fact they are afraid of calm. Intensity feels familiar. It carries urgency, unpredictability, longing, and emotional charge. For a nervous system shaped in early relational stress, intensity signals aliveness. It mirrors the emotional climate of childhood, where love was uncertain and attention had to be earned, pursued, or secured. Calm, on the other hand, can feel strangely empty, even threatening, because it offers no familiar cues to orient the body. When love in early life was inconsistent, the child's nervous system learned to associate connection with heightened arousal. Moments of closeness were often followed by distance. Warmth could disappear without warning. The child learned to stay alert, emotionally mobilized, ready to respond. Over time, the state of arousal became normalized. The body adapted to it as a baseline. What we later call chemistry or passion is often the activation of this old pattern. As adults, this shows up as attraction to emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or conflicted partners. The push and pull creates a sense of intensity that feels meaningful. The highs feel euphoric, the lows feel devastating. Together, they create a cycle that mimics early attachment experiences. When love finally feels steady, available, and non-dramatic, the body may register boredom rather than safety. The absence of tension feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity is easily mistaken for lack of connection. This confusion leads people to doubt healthy relationships. They may say, "Something is missing," without knowing what that something is. What is missing is not love, but activation. The nervous system, accustomed to intensity, does not yet know how to recognize peace as connection. It equates love with emotional charge rather than emotional presence. As a result, relationships that offer consistency and care may feel flat, while relationships that offer instability feel intoxicating. Intensity also provides distraction. When emotions are extreme, there is little room for self-awareness. The focus remains on the other person, the conflict, the longing, the repair. This keeps deeper feelings at bay, grief, loneliness, emptiness that may surface in stillness. Calm intimacy removes this distraction. It creates space, and in that space, unprocessed pain can emerge. The body may resist this by seeking stimulation, drama, or emotional turbulence. We often glorify intensity in romantic narratives. We call it passion, spark, or fate. Rarely do we ask what role the nervous system plays in these experiences. Intensity is not inherently unhealthy, but when it is the primary indicator of love, it often signals unresolved attachment wounds. It means the body is responding to familiarity, not safety. The heart may believe it is choosing love, while the nervous system is choosing what it knows. This is why some people repeatedly leave relationships, just as they become stable. As conflict decreases and predictability increases, anxiety rises. The body, no longer occupied with managing uncertainty, begins to feel exposed. Without the adrenaline of pursuit or repair, the person may feel restless, disconnected, or numb. They may conclude that they have fallen out of love, when in reality they have entered unfamiliar territory. Learning to tolerate calm is a developmental process. It requires retraining the nervous system to recognize safety without stimulation. This does not mean eliminating passion or emotion, but expanding the range of what feels acceptable. It means noticing the impulse to create intensity and pausing long enough to feel what lies beneath it. Often, what emerges is vulnerability without urgency, presence without performance. As people begin to stay with this experience, their perception of love changes. They start to sense warmth rather than excitement, steadiness rather than thrill. They notice subtle forms of connection, shared silence, gentle touch, mutual regulation, that were previously overlooked. The body learns, gradually, that love does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, without demand, without threat, without the need to prove or pursue, and in that quiet, something long deprived of rest begins to soften. We are conditioned to believe that healing means fixing what is broken. We search for techniques, strategies, and self-improvement plans, assuming that if we work hard enough, we can correct our emotional patterns. But this mindset often mirrors the very environment that created the wound, an environment where performance mattered more than presence, where acceptance was earned rather than given, When healing becomes another project, the nervous system does not relax, it braces. Curiosity offers a different entry point. Curiosity does not demand change. It invites observation. When we approach our reactions with curiosity, we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What is happening to me right now?" This shift may seem subtle, but it alters the internal climate dramatically. Correction implies judgment. Curiosity implies safety. And safety is the prerequisite for healing. When a person reacts strongly in relationship, becoming defensive, withdrawn, overwhelmed, or overly accommodating, the habitual response is self-criticism. "I shouldn't feel this way. I'm overreacting. I'm being difficult." These judgments add another layer of stress to an already activated system. Curiosity, by contrast, slows the process down. It allows the reaction to be felt without being escalated. It creates space between sensation and interpretation. This space is essential because most relational reactions originate in the body before they reach conscious thought. A tightening in the chest, a drop in the stomach, a rush of heat, these sensations arise automatically. When we meet them with curiosity, we begin to notice patterns. We see how certain tones of voice, facial expressions, or relational dynamics consistently activate us. This noticing is not about control, it is about recognition. Curiosity also softens resistance. Many people fear that if they allow themselves to feel what they feel, they will be overwhelmed. But feelings persist not because they are too strong, but because they are resisted. When sensation is allowed, it often shifts on its own. The body completes responses that were once interrupted. The nervous system recalibrates. This is not something we make happen, it is something we allow. In relationships, curiosity transforms conflict. Instead of immediately defending or explaining, a person may pause and ask internally, "What is this bringing up for me?" This pause interrupts automatic cycles. It reduces reactivity. It creates the possibility of response rather than reflex. Over time, this practice builds trust not just with others, but with oneself. The person learns that they can stay present with discomfort without losing themselves or the relationship. Correction, by contrast, often reinforces the wound. When we try to force ourselves to be different, we repeat the message learned in childhood: "Who you are is not acceptable as you are." Curiosity offers a reparative experience. It says, "Your experience makes sense." Even when behavior needs to change, that change emerges more sustainably from understanding than from pressure. Curiosity also fosters compassion for others. When we recognize our own reactions as protective, we become more able to see the same in our partners. This does not mean tolerating harm or ignoring boundaries. It means responding from clarity rather than blame. When two people bring curiosity into a relationship, they create an environment that neither may have had growing up, one where emotion is met with interest rather than avoidance. Healing, in this sense, is not a destination. It is an ongoing relationship with experience. It is the practice of turning toward rather than away, of listening rather than fixing. Each moment of curiosity interrupts an old pattern and offers the nervous system a new message: you are allowed to feel, and feeling does not end connection. Over time, this message is repeated enough that it begins to be believed, not just intellectually, but viscerally, and in that belief, something long defended finally begins to rest for many people. Authenticity feels dangerous not because it is inherently risky, but because it was once associated with loss. There was a time when being fully oneself led to disapproval, withdrawal, or emotional rupture. The child learned that certain truths, needs, emotions, preferences, threatened connection, so those truths were hidden, reshaped, or silenced. Over time, the child learned to belong by editing themselves, and belonging became dependent on self-censorship. This adaptation works, but it comes at a cost. When authenticity is suppressed, relationships may be maintained, but they are not nourishing. The person is present, but not fully. They are seen, but not known. Love under these conditions becomes fragile because it is based on a version of the self that requires constant management. The effort to maintain this version creates tension, anxiety, and fatigue. Love feels conditional because, in a sense, it is. As adults, this dynamic often shows up as chronic self-monitoring in relationships. People may constantly assess how they are being perceived, adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict or rejection. They may struggle to name their needs, fearing that doing so will disrupt harmony. Even when partners are kind and receptive, the body may remain guarded, anticipating a negative response that never comes. The danger is no longer external but internalized. When authenticity feels unsafe, love cannot settle. Intimacy requires congruence, the alignment of inner experience and outer expression. Without this alignment, closeness feels hollow. The person may feel lonely even in relationship, sensing that something essential is missing. What is missing is not affection, but presence. The nervous system cannot relax into connection when it is busy suppressing truth. The return to authenticity does not happen through dramatic confession or radical honesty. It happens incrementally, through small acts of self-acknowledgement, noticing a feeling and allowing it to exist, expressing a preference without apology, setting a boundary and staying present with the discomfort that follows. Each of these moments signals to the body that authenticity does not automatically lead to abandonment. As these experiences accumulate, the nervous system begins to update its expectations. The body learns that connection can survive difference. That being seen does not always result in rejection. That love can expand rather than contract in response to truth. This learning is experiential, not conceptual. It requires relationships, both internal and external, that can tolerate authenticity without collapse. When authenticity becomes safer, love changes quality. It becomes less effortful. There is less need to manage impressions or anticipate reactions. Energy previously used for self-monitoring becomes available for presence. The person can listen without preparing defenses, speak without rehearsing outcomes. Love becomes something that happens through the person rather than something they must maintain. This does not mean that relationships become free of conflict or discomfort. Authenticity may introduce tension where there was once compliance. But this tension is different. It is generative rather than destabilizing. It reflects two real people in contact, rather than one person adapting to preserve connection. Over time, this kind of contact builds trust, not because it is smooth, but because it is real. Love returns when authenticity no longer feels like a threat to survival. When the body learns that it can remain connected while being true, the old equation dissolves. Self-expression and belonging are no longer opposites. They become mutually reinforcing. And in that integration, love ceases to be a performance shaped by fear and becomes a lived experience grounded in presence, where connection no longer demands disappearance and being oneself no longer risks being alone.